constitutional government. And we have a wonderful speaker today, Lorraine Clark. But I first want to introduce Professor Paul Cantor, who's going to chair this meeting. He's professor of English at University of Virginia, and he's here at Harvard this term giving a course on Shakespeare's politics. And our program is moving into the field of literature and politics to some extent this fall. This is the first of our 3 sessions on that, in that subfield, if you want to call it that, Jane Austen, and then we're going to have Shakespeare with the very same Paul Cantor later, and then our last meeting will be about a man called Homer. But let me now introduce Professor Paul Cantor.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and to introduce a former student of mine, Lorraine Clark, who comes to us from a foreign country, which shall remain nameless, but it's on our borders, and it's north of here. But Professor Clark teaches at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. She's taught at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and at Mount Holyoke College in this very state. She was briefly a native of Belchertown, and her husband was the mayor of Belchertown at one point. I've been told downgrade that he was the town manager of Granby, actually. But anyway, Lorraine has roots here in Massachusetts as well. She's the author of a book called Blake, Kierkegaard, and the Spectre Dialectics, which shows that in earlier days she was attracted to really weird, idiosyncratic, and dare I say crazy thinkers. But she's sobered up and has found the virtues of Jane Austen. Indeed, talking to her, I realized she's moving from the 19th century back into the 18th century, and even has gotten interested in people like Aristotle. So the brief fling with Blake and Kierkegaard has been overcome. And indeed, she's going to talk to us today about Jane Austen and Mansfield Park. Lorraine has revealed to me that she still believes that literature has meaning. This isolates her within the profession as I'm isolated, but it does mean we'll hear something interesting today about Jane Austen. Now, I am told it is a complete coincidence that of the 6 canonical Jane Austen novels, Lorraine has chosen Mansfield Park. I'm a little suspicious when I hear that the alternative topic proposed to her were an obscure Gothic novel called Claflin Hall, or a talk on James Stewart and Harvey the Rabbit. But anyway, it's a very interesting novel, and again, I'm sure it's just a coincidence it's called Mansfield Park.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm honored to be here. It's a particular pleasure that to know that I'll be speaking to people who are interested in Jane Austen at the level of ideas. It's the kind of attention that she gets less and less these days as the Austen industry in the popular media spins out of control, and this is increasingly true even in university classrooms. I don't understand how anyone teaches 6 novels in 12 weeks, plus all the spin-offs. Well, since this is a luncheon talk, combining good food and good conversation, I thought I'd discuss Dr. Grant, the gluttonous clergyman, who comes into the living or church benefice associated with Mansfield Park upon the death of its most recent parson, the Reverend Mr. Norris. Tom Bertram cheerfully reflects to himself upon meeting Dr. Grant that he is a short-necked, apoplectic sort of fellow who plied well with good things will soon pop off. And this is how Tom consoles himself for the fact that his own self-indulgence has deprived his brother Edmund of this living that should have eventually been his. And Tom turns out to be correct. Dr. Grant has indeed, by novel's end, brought on apoplexy and death by 3 great institutionary dinners in 1 week. He also, at one point in the novel, is said to do the honors of the sandwich tray. so we know where he would have positioned himself here today. But Professor Mansfield asked me to summarize briefly the main points of my article that some of you will have kindly read for this meeting today. So I'm just going to back up a little and set the context for Dr. Grant. I argued there that Mansfield Park is centrally about the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, that several of Austen's 18th century predecessors were engaged in, primarily as a reaction against Thomas Hobbes. Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, Henry Fielding, and most of all, Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, whose collected works were enormously influential on the whole vocabulary of manners, morals, politeness, conversation, and taste in the long 18th century. Several unusual elements in the novel suggest profound affinities with Shaftesbury. Firstly, its distinctive vocabulary. Such terms as enthusiasm, rapture, reverie, rhapsody, harmony, beauty, order and disorder, the natural affections of kindness, pity, gratitude, friend and friendship, taste, moral taste, innate taste, criticism, good sense, good humor, ill humor, sense, nonsense, stupidity, dullness, intelligible and unintelligible, and most of all, the ubiquity of the terms improvement, mind, and pleasure. The internal evidence is overwhelming, I think, that it's all we have. Austen also uses the term soliloquy, so central to Shaftesbury and to my argument, only 3 times in the novel, but each time very strategically placed. In addition, the novel is unusually allegorically designed, aligning it with Shaftesbury's emphasis on the design, implicit form, order, harmony, intelligibility of nature. It's been said, actually by Eva Braun, that nothing in Jane Austen is metaphorical, but in this novel, everything is metaphorical. And that's caused the difficulties, I think, in interpreting it. The novel sets up an allegorical debate between the pulpit and the theater, as traditionally the 2 most powerful influences on manners and mores. And these terms in turn signify a debate between virtue or moral instruction, the pulpit, and pleasure, the theater, understood more broadly as poetry, the useful and the pleasurable. I further suggested that Fanny Price's art of soliloquy is Austen's solution to that debate or division. Fanny's habit of soliloquizing reflection in her East Room or out in nature is both pleasurable and instructive. Reflecting on her character and conduct is the first step to amending, curing, or improving it. And by teaching others to develop the same habit, often in dialogue with her, Fanny's privately improving method of soliloquy becomes a third and better force than either the pulpit or the theater for improving the national manners of England, precisely Shaftesbury's argument for the improving role of soliloquy. This makes the art of soliloquy, finally, a metaphor for Austen's own art as an author, and hence makes the novel her defense of poetry as both pleasurable and instructive, aligning her with the Roman poet Horace, who is more quoted in Shaftesbury's collected works than any other author. But I argued as well that behind this overtly schematic allegorical dialogue between virtue and pleasure lies a second and more profound dialogue between the moderns, who would separate virtue from pleasure, and the ancients who do not. 2 quite uncharacteristically metaphysical scenes bring this to the fore, and they're the only metaphysical scenes in all of Austen's novels. The famous stargazing scene, in which Fanny and Edmund muse on the beauty, harmony, order, and sublimity of nature in the night sky, and what I'll call the garden gazing scene, in which Fanny attempts to have a similarly harmonious dialogue with Mary Crawford about the wonders of the human mind, and especially its faculty of memory. They are gazing at nature, but Fanny cannot look at nature without seeing mind, the human mind, but also rising to a kind of metaphysical mind, capital M. the sense of an intelligible, ordered whole in nature or the universe. In both scenes, then, soliloquizing dialogue makes explicit an indwelling telos intelligibility, form, or purposiveness out there in nature itself. And this order is both beautiful and good, a form of moral beauty which is highly pleasurable to the contemplative mind, which observes it with a kind of rational enthusiasm, in philosophical rhapsody, as Shaftesbury terms it. To see nature, including human nature, as informed by this indwelling form, at once good and beautiful, stands in stark contrast to the modern, primarily Lockean view of nature as a blank slate, a mere nothing, as Austen repeatedly terms it in Mansfield Park, and human nature as informed by no higher purposiveness than selfishness, the self Mary Crawford sees when she gazes at nature in this identical garden with Fanny. And we begin to realize that the entire novel is informed by this debate. Debates about landscape gardening. One forlorn estate was a mere nothing before Repton took it in hand, the landscape improver. About the raising of children, Fanny too is forlorn, allegedly a mere nothing before the Bertrams took her in hand. In our selfishness, we moderns have forgotten the ancient teleological understanding of nature. We are absent-minded because we think that nature itself is absent of mind. Like Mary Crawford, we see only self, nature without a nous, as Pope says in the Dunciad. It is literally unintelligible to us modern dunces. I suggest then that Fanny's rehearsals with the young, modern, consummately stupid Mr. Rushworth, in which she tries to help him remember his lines for the play, thus giving him the brain that nature has denied, as Henry Crawford compliments her, becomes in fact the emblem for how Austen conceives of her own relation to modernity. She is Fanny Price, helping us improve our memories. Her novels are attempts to remind our modern understanding of nature and human nature through their emphasis on soliloquy, understood as philosophical reflection, dialogue, rereading, and recollection, practiced not only among her characters themselves, but by us equally as her readers. That would suggest, lastly, that Mansfield Park is not just about Fanny Price coming out into society and Edmund's ordination as a clergyman, but Jane Austen's own coming out as an author, recognizing her vocation as someone who, like Shakespeare, can improve the manners and mores of her nation. And after Mansfield Park, of course, comes Emma, the consummate kind of symphonic Austen novel and persuasion. So there was a sense, I think, of really coming into her own and a sense of what she could do. So just what then is the foundation of morals and manners for Jane Austen? Does she somehow usurp the place of religion to make poetry and aesthetic taste her foundation, as my own reading here might seem to suggest? Wouldn't that make her a modern, indeed a kind of romantic? Well, Dr. Grant's gluttony, I suggest, is an extended pun on the whole idea of taste, understood literally, of course, as the tasting of real food, but also metaphorically as signifying aesthetic taste. He is not a curate, but an epicure, or maybe there's a word epicurate instead. And Austen's real interest, like Shaftesbury's, is in defending the idea of moral taste, a term her narrator uses in this novel alone of the 6 novels. Taste is in all of them, but not moral taste. The narrator here also speaks of an innate taste, which is a unique usage in Austen again. Well, what's interesting about this is that it's the words taste and sentiment that David Hume singles out, purportedly differentiating the ancients from the moderns on the question of the foundation of morals, a differentiation he then disputes. And I quote from Hume's Inquiry Concerning Morals, 1777. There has been a controversy of late concerning the general foundation of morals, whether they be derived from reason or from sentiment. The ancient philosophers, although they often affirm that virtue is nothing but conformity to reason, yet in general seem to consider morals as deriving from their existence from taste and sentiment. The elegant Lord Shaftesbury, who first gave occasion to remark this distinction, and who in general adhered to the principles of the ancients, is not himself entirely free from this confusion. No man reasons concerning another's beauty, he remarks, but frequently concerning the justice or injustice of his actions. This is why there is indeed no disputing of taste. The perception of beauty for Hume cannot be a rational one, but neither can the perception of virtue for him be so. It is easy to ascertain the distinct boundaries of reason and taste, he affirms. The former conveys knowledge of truth and falsehood, the latter gives the sentiment of beauty and deformity, vice and virtue. And that's from an appendix concerning moral sentiment. Thus, for Hume, de fact and value separate themselves. Like all moderns, and unlike Shaftesbury and Austen, Hume has forgotten the ontological order in nature understood as a whole, rather than mere corpuscular parts, the rational perception of which whole provides their foundation of morals. Yet the fact of Dr. Grant's gluttony provides yet another possibility for the foundation of morals, one underscored by the fact that he is a Christian clergyman, the foundation in Christian supernature, which would render that gluttony a sin. Dr. Grant is said to be very fond of eating and would have a good dinner every day. He enjoys the visit of his wife's half-sister and brother, the Crawfords, as an excuse for drinking claret every day. He complains about the insipid taste of the Moor Park apricots Mrs. Norris planted in the parsonage garden. He is selfishly indisposed one day because the pheasant was tough. And this turns out to be a crucial indisposition because it keeps Mrs. Grant from being able to perform her part in the amateur theatrical the Bertram family is planning to put on in Sir Thomas's absence. And it's only Sir Thomas's unexpected arrival that saves Fanny, after all her principled resistance, from having to stand in for Mrs. Grant. On top of this, Dr. Grant's obsession with food sets a bad example and is a major source of Mary Crawford's general contempt for clergymen. Unlike soldiers and sailors, she sarcastically observes to Edmund, the clergyman prefers an income ready-made to the trouble of working for one, and has the best intentions of doing nothing, her favorite word, all the rest of his days but eat, drink, and grow fat. It is indolence, Mr. Bertram, indolence and love of ease, a want of all laudable ambition, a taste for good company, which makes men clergymen. A clergyman has nothing to do but be slovenly and selfish, read the newspaper, watch the weather, and quarrel with his wife. His curate does all the work, and the business of his life is to dine. Accused by Edmund of falsely generalizing about clergymen, only from what you have been told at your uncle's table, Mary sharply responds that she speaks from her general experience of Dr. Grant's example. Though Dr. Grant is, I dare say, a good scholar and clever and often preaches good sermons and is very respectable, I see him to be an indolent, selfish bon vivant who must have his palate consulted in everything, who will not stir a finger for the convenience of anyone, and who, moreover, if the cook makes a blunder, is out of humor with his excellent wife. Henry and I were partly driven out this evening by a disappointment over a green goose, which he could not get the better of. My poor sister was forced to stay and bear it. So again, is the religious sin of gluttony Austen's real focus here? Dr. Grant's carnal worldliness versus the otherworldly asceticism a good clergyman ought to exemplify. I think we can easily see that it is not, that her first target is hypocrisy. the fact that the clergyman who presumably preaches against gluttony on Sundays, in fact, practices it at home privately the other 6 days of the week. This is a clergyman who does not practice what he preaches or professes. This implies, in turn, a divorce between his private and public selves, that his public role as a clergyman is somehow just acting a part that isn't who he really is. Standing up in the pulpit is mere theater for Dr. Grant. Dr. Grant thus embodies the typically modern aestheticism divorced from morality, taste divorced from moral taste, which Edmund criticizes when he says the clergymen, as the guardians of religion and morals, and consequently of the manners which result from their influence, ought not to be the arbiters of good breeding, the regulators of refinement and courtesy, but rather the arbiters of conduct, the result of good principles. As the clergy are or are not what they ought to be, so the rest of the nation, again, is what he tells Mary. Worst of all here, though, is Dr. Grant's sin against the harmony, order, and domestic peace of the household. His obsession with food puts him again out of humor with his excellent wife, and drives his sister and brother-in-law out of the house to seek refuge from this domestic squabbling at Mansfield Park. Edmund singles out this ill humor as a great defect of temper, made worse by a very faulty habit of self-indulgence. Family squabbling is the greatest evil of all, as he elsewhere observes. We had better do anything than be altogether by the ears. So ill humor versus good humor, selfishness versus sociability and kindness, hypocrisy, squabbling, these are Dr. Grant's major sins. And it is crucial to see that these are all sins against family piety, order, peace, and harmony, family constituting Austen's anti-Hobbesian metaphor here for our natural sociability. She thus once again transposes the religious vocabulary of evil into a more naturalistic key. Dr. Grant sins not so much against God or divine law or religious sanctions, but against nature and human nature. So is there any hope for Dr. Grant? Or is Mary Crawford right that on the modern understanding of human nature, there's no cure for selfishness? Can the curate himself be cured? After hearing Mary out on the subject, Edmund concedes defeat. Fanny, it goes against us, he admits. We cannot attempt to defend Dr. Grant. But here is Fanny's proffered hope, at least, for a cure. No, replied Fanny, but we need not give up his profession for all that, because whatever profession Dr. Grant had chosen, he would have taken not a good temper into it. Besides, I cannot but suppose that whatever there may be to wish otherwise in Dr. Grant would have been in greater danger of becoming worse in a more active and worldly profession, where he might have escaped that knowledge of himself, the frequently at least of that knowledge, which it is impossible he should escape as he is now. A sensible man like Dr. Grant, cannot be in the habit of teaching others their duty every week, cannot go to church twice every Sunday and preach such very good sermons in so good a manner as he does without being the better for it himself. It must make him think. And I have no doubt that he oftener endeavors to restrain himself than he would if he had been anything but a clergyman. Fanny's hope, then, is that the habit of solitary reflection Dr. Grant's profession necessarily requires of him will lead him to that knowledge of himself that will eventuate an improvement or cure for his own character and conduct. And notice that this solitary reflective activity is not described as an especially religious inwardness. It is not described as prayer, as confession, repentance, or a plea of forgiveness for his sins. It is rather described as a form of self-improvement to which Dr. Grant's profession as a clergyman is in fact subordinated. His profession merely offers him more opportunity for such leisured self-reflection than other more active professions would do. This indeed is the role that Sundays and chapels provide in the novel as a whole. They provide the time and space for self-improving soliloquies. But Mary Crawford remains unconvinced. "I wish you a better fate, Miss Price, than to be the wife of a man whose amiableness depends upon his own sermons. For though he may preach himself into a good humor every Sunday, it will be bad enough to have him quarreling about green geese from Monday morning to Saturday night." Soliloquizing reflection allows oneself to preach oneself not into faith in God, notice, but into a good humor, into a better because more sociable, friendly, kindly, familial frame of mind. For Shaftesbury, this good humor is in fact identical with theism, belief in God. While he wants to separate moral virtue from religion or religious piety, he concedes that good-humored people are more likely to be theists because they believe in nature as an ordered and harmonious whole. Ill-humored people are by contrast more likely to be atheists because they see only what he calls a distracted universe of disordered parts without an ordered whole. And his phrase is deity made void from the moralists. But notice that one's God depends on and arises secondarily from one's humor or temper or nature. This brings me to Shaftesbury's unique and remarkable reaction against John Locke, his former tutor on the foundation of morals, with which I will conclude this talk. Shaftesbury's turn to the ancient idea of nature as a corrective of a Christian ethics grounded in Christian supernature regards Locke as even more dangerous than Thomas Hobbes. To see morality as an imposed law restraining our natural bent, as do Hobbes and Locke, is to make war on virtue itself, he declares, and I'm quoting from one of his letters. It was Mr. Locke that struck the home blow, for Mr. Hobbes's character and base slavish principles in government took off the point of his philosophy. 'Twas Mr. Locke that struck at all fundamentals, threw all order and virtue out of the world, and made the very ideas of these, which are the same as those of God, unnatural, and without foundation in our minds. Locke's Christian supernaturalism and rejection of innate ideas in Shaftesbury's view, in other words, locates the ground of morals entirely outside of this world, outside of our minds, outside of nature. It endorses a religion based on hope and fear, rewards and punishments, duty and obligation, all against the bent of our nature. The kind of fearful, awe-inspiring, religious or godlike authority Sir Thomas Bertram perhaps exemplifies in Mansfield Park. Is this why his name is Thomas? Again, however, by making nature and human nature themselves the foundation of morals and religion, Shaftesbury does not necessarily reject theism for reasons I mentioned above. Rather, he argues only the ancients understood the proper relation between religious piety and moral virtue, the proper relation their understanding of nature leads to. Speaking of his own difficulties, writing between opposed camps of free thinkers on the subject of religion, he laments, "The men of wit and raillery, whose pleasantest entertainment is in exposing the weak sides of religion, are so desperately afraid of being drawn into any serious thoughts of it, that they look upon a man as guilty of foul play, who assumes the air of a free writer, and at the same time preserves any regard for the principles of natural religion. 'Tis as hard to persuade the one sort that there is any virtue in religion, as the other that there is any virtue out of the verge of their particular community, so that between them both an author must spend his time ill who dares plead for religion and moral virtue without lessening the force of either. And that's his inquiry concerning virtue. It may be that Shaftesbury seeks only to protect himself in dangerous times, but remarkably, we see an identical move in Jane Austen, I think. Forgetting nature in Mansfield Park does not only mean forgetting the ancient teleological view of nature's inherent intelligibility, form, or mind, an ancient ideal of moral virtue. Fanny Price does, after all, wear an amber cross, albeit more as a remembrance, I have argued, of friendship, kinship, and family ties than as a traditional symbol of Christianity. And she does, after all, marry a serious and practicing clergyman. Austen pointedly reminds us, too, that all the churches in the novel are being forgotten as well, deliberately walled out of sight of the Norris Grant parsonage, not so close to the great house as often happens in old places. Julia Bertram approvingly notes of the church in the village near Southerton, fallen out of use in the case of the Southerton Chapel. Further, it is Sir Thomas who is most of all forgotten in the amateur theatricals. Like Shaftesbury, Austen's free-thinking wit and raillery, which so exposes the weak sides of religion in the gluttony of a Dr. Grant, clearly has its seriousness too. Does she, like Shaftesbury, turn to nature in order to plead for religion and moral virtue without lessening the force of either?
Well, thank you for reminding us how funny Jane Austen is, but also how serious she is. Okay, we'll just throw the floor open to questions now.
I had two kind of clarificatory questions about what you said about Shaftesbury, and then just a general question. So, on Shaftesbury's view of Locke as more dangerous than Hobbes, the reasons you gave seem to be that the Locke's essay lays out in more radical form an attack on the ideas, including the idea of God and virtue in the human mind, but on the specific point of whether God, the idea of God as the foundation of our minds, Hobbes is already on the record as saying we can have no idea of God. So I just didn't understand why Shaftesbury really thought, unless he thought Locke had simply said more, why Locke was more radical. Another question I wasn't, maybe just for your presentation on Shaftesbury was, were you saying that Shaftesbury meant because of Locke's incredible influence as a critic of morality, one was left with the paradox of if in defending religion one weakened attachment to particular moral communities, and in defending particular moral communities one weakened attachment to religion? And if so, that Shaftesbury's view of Locke's negative influence, is that what you meant? Because it seems that Locke and others had argued that it was Christianity that had actually brought this problem about, that in defending belief in a divine being, one weakened belief in the fatherland and vice versa. So in other words, is Shaftesbury critiquing Locke for something Locke critiqued Christianity for? So that's just to clarify what you meant about Shaftesbury. And then my general question was, when you talked about Austen's critique of hypocrisy, isn't hypocrisy more of a sin that moderns believe in rather than ancients? And so why does that make her taking the side of the ancients to critique hypocrisy, which it seems to me a phrase that is not as, the phenomenon described is not as clearly troublesome to Greek political philosophers as it is perhaps to modern Christians.
Well, on the first question, my understanding of what Shaftesbury is saying about why Locke is more dangerous is it's almost as though he thinks Hobbes was so vicious and mean-spirited that he disqualified himself, right? Whereas Locke looks like, Locke looks like a more amiable guy or something, and so people are people don't realize how dangerous Locke is, because he's just not as obviously vile as Shaftesbury would see. Or Hobbes as being.
Okay.
Yeah. On the second question, I understood Shaftesbury to be saying in that quotation, "'Tis as hard to persuade the one sort that there is any virtue in religion as the other that there is any virtue out of the verge of their particular community." That he's saying there's these two opposed camps, that if you, that you can't see moral virtue, that somehow religion is degrading the idea of moral virtue as being an innate human characteristic, because it is placing it in a supernatural world. But on the other hand, the people that are just arguing for virtue without a grounding in some kind of theism, however attenuated it is in Shaftesbury, are making virtue relativistic, that they can't understand virtue outside the verge of their particular community. And so he would seem to, rhetorically at least, be trying to position himself between those two things, and as he says, argue for both of them, but with kind of boundaries between them. Does that?
Well, I mean, is it more a critique or a discussion of Christian or biblical religion, or of belief of any divine kind as such that Shaftesbury is making these remarks?
I think.
Because some of the things he's saying are things that were said in criticizing Christianity by its attackers earlier.
Yeah.
And so.
I don't know Locke well enough to know how accurate Shaftesbury's characterization of Locke is. Locke was his tutor, and I think he certainly is reading Locke as a Christian, right, who is grounding morality in supernatural, in a Christian supernatural, and he really doesn't like that. He wrote quite a scathing letter about Locke's last letter to Collins, I think it was, in which Locke, Shaftesbury's response to Locke speaking about heaven was, well, this is spoken like a good Christian, but it's hardly what I would have expected from a dying philosopher. So he certainly is reading Locke as on the side of a Christian supernaturalism.
What about his last question about whether hypocrisy is modern, rather modern vice or modern accusation?
Yeah. It might be, I don't know really what the status of hypocrisy is in someone like Aristotle, but the division between, I think Jane Austen is definitely fingering it as herself as a major problem of modernity. So you're asking, doesn't that make her a modern? That she does that? She thinks there should be consistency.
Just based on your schema, I mean, other people have other schemas of what modern, what makes new. Just that it seems to be a problem more indicative of Christianity than pre-Christian. I mean, it's not just a matter of Aristotle versus Locke or something. I just also think it seems to be a demand that Christianity might make in some way.
Wouldn't you answer with what you said about Dr. Grant? That in a way hypocrisy can even have a good side. It forces you to, or if it forces you to face the contradiction between your fine life and your rigorous principles.
And that's again the habit, isn't it? That the habit of having to sit down and write a sermon or 2 sermons a week is going to force him to confront his own inconsistency.
Yeah, so there's kind of cure within hypocrisy if you reflect.
I mean, maybe
Yes.
the ancients would see hypocrisy as in the form of self-contradiction. Like, when Socrates questions people, he brings out their self-contradiction, not in order to accuse them of hypocrisy, but to get them to think a little bit about themselves.
It seems to me that hypocrisy became a much larger theme in Christianity in the Gospels when Jesus sort of accused of the priests at the time of being hypocrites. So the actual word is used more frequently, and so maybe it's because of Christianity that hypocrisy becomes such a more important theme than the ancient.
Yeah, well, faith becomes so important under Christianity, and there's nothing comparable in the ancient world. Although the word hypocrisy is Greek, and it's from hypokrites, which is the Greek word for actor, which kind of then ties up with all the stuff about the theater in Mansfield Park. Yes, sir.
This is more of a contribution to the budding discussion on hypocrisy. I think you could distinguish between a sort of the sense of hypocrisy in Christianity and the way that people commonly use it today, and those are, I think, two different things. In Christianity, hypocrisy tends to be used as an accusation against someone, as you say, who is acting the part of someone virtuous. So hypocrisy is feigning virtue when you don't have it. So it seems like maybe Dr. Grant doesn't, I'm not sure that sense of hypocrisy would be the right one to describe it. As people use it in sort of commonplace speech today, it seems to me that people use it simply to identify a disjunction between what you believe or say and what you do. And so in that sense, Dr. Grant would be a hypocrite because he's preaching against gluttony while being a glutton. But I think that sense of hypocrisy wasn't actually a big issue for Christianity. If you're the town drunk and yet you're baptized, you don't say, oh gosh, I'm a hypocrite, so the way I'll resolve my hypocrisy is by denying Christianity, which is what probably someone in the 20th century would do, right? You just say, well, I'm a sinner. So, whenever the media spots someone who is a believing Christian and also a sinner, they say a hypocrisy, right? Whereas, of course, according to the Christians, they're all sinners, and so it's not a hypocrite to affirm that gluttony is a sin and also be stuck in it somehow. So there is a sort of, maybe there's a kind of Christian side to Dr. Grant in that he doesn't abandon his office of preaching. But the sort of hypocrisy that the Gospels condemn, I think might be something else.
Yes.
Did you want to respond to that or no? I just want to thank you for a really delightful presentation, and I completely agree with your characterizing Austen as really showing herself in a way on the level of Shakespeare in this novel. And I think you asked the right question about the novel, is what is the source of Austen's argument on the side of morality or virtue? I guess I would disagree on your emphasis on soliloquy because this is a form, and you can imagine Homer Simpson soliloquizing about beer, and it would get you nowhere, So and I think but that's maybe to make fun a little bit because you do say that you have to soliloquize on moral conduct, but you focus on gluttony as the sin in this novel, but really the crucial question of the novel is adultery. That's the crux of and that's where the difficult question arises. And in a way, it's not a question of the form of soliloquizing, but it's a question of a practical moral question. Should Edmund choose a woman like Mary as his wife, or should he choose a woman like Fanny as his wife? And that turns on their reaction to the sin of adultery. And Mary doesn't see it as a sin. She sees it as something that has to be somehow equivocated. And Fanny is completely overwhelmed. She gets it herself, she's sick, and she's in a moral, she becomes ill for days when she reacts, when she hears about this terrible sin that her cousin has committed. So that's the question would be, what is the source of this absolute moral prohibition against adultery? Is it Christian, or is it Christian belief, Christian doctrine, or is it the morality of ancient rationality and the moral world order? And that's a very big question, where those two, and where Austen comes down is probably not either where Fanny is or where Mary is. And I think where I would maybe pick on your presentation of religion in your presentation a little bit is that the way you characterize the evangelicalism is Mary's point of view. Austen never expresses anything like the view of religion that you present in your paper. I think she's careful not to say anything like that. But Mary refers to the Methodists and in her final speech, which absolutely determines Edmund's choice. So those are just some thoughts on.
On the question of adultery, again, one could argue that the terms that Fanny puts that in, could I see, I have a footnote from the novel about that. Fanny's horrified that it's a violation, again, of family ties. That's what she says about it.
Well, that makes the crime worse because of they're so tied up all in one, the relations with one another. They're all so close with one another. But it's the sin that Thomas Bertram won't allow to be overlooked. When he won't allow that Maria will come back into the neighborhood and become a member of society. And so it's a very absolute prohibition, and the question is, what is the source of that prohibition? And can we rely on reason for that, or do we need belief?
Well, what Fanny says is, and actually, I've got the novel. In this footnote, I say the adulterous affair between Maria and Henry horrifies family as a violation of family relations. The whole family, both families connected as they were by tie upon tie, all friends, all intimate together, exclamation mark. So I guess kind of, the argument throughout here is that metaphor of the family seems to be the foundation of the naturalistic foundation of morals for Austen, and it's also friendship, right? This is where it's deeper even than family understood as simply. She doesn't simply mean the bonds of nature, but for the kind of natural sociability of human beings is what is being really fundamentally violated by the adultery. So again, it's like a transposition of a more absolutist, or let's say evangelical religious language into a tempered, a rational form of piety, I think would be the argument.
But one has to come down on one side or the other, whether it is a sin or a crime, or whether it's not.
Right.
And but if you want to cast it in the form of family piety, then we can take it a step further and say that family piety was a question for the ancients, whether that was natural or not. I mean, that in a way, that's the question of Plato's Republic, where you have Book 5 of the Republic, and he proposes the abolition of marriage and the formation of a society on a completely different basis. So that the ancients were quite radical in their questioning. And I think that Austen is probably can rise close to that level of inquiry. And she doesn't simply accept this notion of family piety as part of the moral world order, but she wants to explore that. And I think by not taking seriously this dichotomy between the prohibition based on religious belief, or is it an absolute prohibition which is based on reason, or is it something that we can't, as Aristotle puts it, you can never commit adultery with the right woman in the right place at the right time. So that it's an absolute prohibition in Aristotle as well, but Aristotle is very sensitive as to what the grounds of that might be, and whether what the source of such a prohibition would be.
Well, I'm not sure I'm speaking to this. The other really crucial refinement she puts on the idea of family is that family ties understood as simply instinctual are not sufficient in themselves. I mean, this is what Fanny discovers when she goes to visit her mother at Portsmouth, and she's very disappointed because her mother is initially very happy to see her, but then the narrator says the instinctive nature was soon satisfied, and Mrs. Price's affection had no other source. So that because they haven't been, the necessity of leisure and reflection and conversation and becoming friends is where I guess I'm seeing the rationalism of the ancients really figuring in a major way the whole novel's emphasis on reflection, and that really moral sense is not moral until that rational element of reflection has made it so. It has to be a just affection. So I'm not sure whether, does that, you seem to want an either or, that I'm suggesting both Austen and Shaftesbury actually want to get away from. I think that the attempt is to correct evangelical religious enthusiasm. In fact, Shaftesbury is very explicit about that in a letter concerning enthusiasm, that he wants to temper evangelical zeal and this kind of absolutist thinking. And the stargazing scene is in Mansfield Park is clearly so much that kind of tempered rational enthusiasm that is manifested by Fanny. Edmund actually says to her, I like to hear your enthusiasm. But she's wanting to get away from, she's wanting to rationalize or make religion rational.
So you think that she would come down on the side of Mary or Fanny? Or does she, I mean, I think that the novel says pretty clearly that she thinks that Mary disqualifies herself as a wife by her reaction to this sin. And that's a pretty harsh thing. I mean, it's not something that's easy to swallow, that life can be that harsh, and that Thomas Bertram is going to be so harsh to Maria. This mistake she makes means the end of the fun in her life. And it's a very harsh, and Austen doesn't disagree with that. I mean, Austen,
right.
But Austen's, I think you're right that Austen's reaction is quite different from Fanny's, and her remarks at the end of the novel, Austen would not fall down in a fit of becoming overwhelmed by this horrible moral failure. But she doesn't make fun of that. She doesn't make fun of what Fanny does, whereas Mary would, and Maria probably would as well. But Austen, in the end, she speaks about the punishment that one would expect in the afterlife, and she doesn't hold that out as a possibility, for example, at the end. So she's very subtle in this treatment, and she treats a whole panoply of all of the considerations that would have to go into that question, that fundamental question of do we rely on our belief or our reason in these fundamental questions in our lives.
I think Austen does identify with Fanny very much, and that you might be the one who's reading Fanny too severely, you know, which is, so many people dislike Fanny Price in this novel. And she's really not meant to be this severe evangelical paragon of Christian virtue that she gets caricatured as. But nonetheless,
agree with that.
her moral decision is absolute. And the terms, again, are put interestingly in terms of taste, right? Hers is a corrupted, vitiated mind, is what Edmonds concludes finally about Mary. And I think there's an incredible sophistication and complexity about the way in which the Crawfords are both presented. Because for Jane Austen, it's really the tragedy of the Crawfords that they have this tremendous potential for the pleasures of mind and virtue. In fact, Henry Crawford is the one who distinguishes between pleasures of the mind and pleasures of the body. When he's talking about how he's going to seduce, his plan is to seduce Fanny Price because, you know, walking and riding is just sort of pleasures of the body, and this is going to be a higher pleasure, and there's this ranking. So both of them have their moments, right, when we feel that things could have gone otherwise with the Crawfords. And they don't, you know, there's the backsliding, but again, the problem would be not reflecting enough. You know, one of the questions in the novel is, what do people do with their leisure time? And the suggestion being that they should be thinking about other people. They should write a letter to the absent Sir Thomas. They should go for a walk and discuss the absence of Thomas. They shouldn't be diverting themselves, you know, away from any fears for what might happen to him. And what Mary does with her leisure time is she plays music. And again, maybe there's a potential for some kind of music of the spheres, such as is suggested in the stargazing scene. But it isn't. It's an addictive habit that is presented as being a purely aesthetic kind of pleasure. So you know, again, part of what I'm trying to do to this is do it by saying that the real dialogue in the novel is not between pleasure and virtue, which would be Mary and Fanny, but the ancient understanding of the relation between pleasure and virtue, which is Fanny, and the modern understanding, which divorces pleasure from virtue, which is Mary.
Yeah, I think I'm sympathetic with what you're trying to do, but I think one other point I would make is, it would be helpful, I think, for thinking about this, is Thomas Bertram's remark at the end about the mistake that he made in the education of his daughter, and he says it was want of principle. And that's the question, where does that, is that principle, is that principle from pleasure, from virtue, or the combination between the two? Are you going to get principle by combining virtue and pleasure,
Sure.
even if you can combine them?
The pleasures of virtue.
I have a question as on the title. I was somehow led to this question. Does it have any significance? I mean, so we have these 6 novels, and one other that is about a place, the Remainder Abbey, and there's one that is a woman's name, one that has a single persuasion, a single noun, and the other 2 are pairs, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. Is there some sense in that array?
Well, again, that's where I think there's a really interesting Shaftesbury connection, because I mentioned this in an email to Professor Mansfield, that I discovered last year that Jane Austen's brother, Edward Austen Knight, who was adopted by wealthy relatives, had in his library at his estate in Kent, which is called Godmersham Park, Shaftesbury's complete collected works. And Austen would go there in the summers and have free access to this library. It's a 1749 edition of Shaftesbury. But the moralists, a philosophical rhapsody in Shaftesbury's characteristics, is also set in a park in which this philosophical dialogue occurs. So, and it seemed to me that Mansfield Park is probably describing Edward Austen Knight's Godmersham Park and the experience of leisured, the uses to which wealth and leisure can be put. The whole of the novel is built on that distinction again, and it sort of reinforces the importance of soliloquy. Fanny's mother never gets to soliloquize because she's too busy with her superfluity of children. It's termed in Portsmouth.
Idle in your busyness.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is three women who profit from Sir Thomas's provision for leisure. Mrs. Norris.
Yes.
Really turns leisure into something positively harmful. And Lady Bertram is
So
indolent. Fanny. And you could also say Mary Crawford, who visits. So this aristocratic patronage doesn't always work.
That's right.
And in itself, it's inadequate, or as we see in the case of the other two daughters, Maria and Julia.
Yes, it is, and it's part of the education of the novel. People should learn to use their leisure well, and Fanny's providing the example of that in her East Room, where she basically remembers. She looks around, she has plants in the room that she's nourishing, she writes letters in the room is full of family resemblances. The Bertrams have also sort of exiled the family portraits from the public spaces of the house and the old furniture. And so, and the narrator says everything in that room was a friend or reminded her of a friend. Tom has given Fanny lots of gifts, which is rather interesting. He's another person who's sort of reformed by his illness. His illness makes him think.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, so much of the whole reflection of the whole point of the novel seems to be people need to think with their leisure time. And thinking is the source of their improvement and reform. And it may rise to that one metaphysical, the stargazing kind of reflection is the most sublime of all of the reflective scenes in the novel.
And then you've got this contrast between Mansfield Park and Portsmouth,
Yes.
the Price family, more democratic, so there's no Sir Thomas there to have money and to dole it out, but there's no leisure.
That's right. Only on Sundays.
Only on Sundays.
On Sundays, Mrs. Price gets to go for a walk by the sea and talk to her friends. It's her day of rest. And they go to church too in the morning, but it's really described as being the only day of the week that she gets the leisure to be sociable and converse with people.
There's an argument for aristocracy over democracy. What greater provision for leisure?
What did it say it?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, it's also an argument, and in the sense that she argues that there are natural inequalities among people as well, right? There is actually no hope for Mr. Rushworth.
Yes.
He doesn't have a mind or a brain. His situation is low, just like his estate. She says it's low, unfavorable for improvement. And so some people don't seem to be born with the innate degree of intelligence that they can be improved.
It would also be an argument for liberal democracy. insofar as it makes room for the activity of the rich.
Well, it's very Aristotelian. I mean, it's the connection between the gentleman and philosophy, only in this case, Austen includes the gentlewoman. But it really, it's what impresses Elizabeth Bennet with Pemberton when she sees in Pride and Prejudice, that Austen is willing to defend these wealthy, especially landowning aristocrats who don't have to work for their money. On the downside, it can make them narrow-minded and worthless, but on the upside, it produces really cultivated people. And this is something she saw traveling around the England of her day.
Yeah, and so I was curious, we've kind of been talking about this, kind of what exactly, which of the ancients do you think that Austen is engaging with in this novel? And in particular, we mentioned Aristotle and Plato, but it sounds, I haven't read the novel, so this was a good introduction, makes me want to go out and read it. But particularly talking about this idea of particularly the stargazing scene of pleasure and virtue and contemplation, it sounds like he's very Neoplatonic in a sense. And so I was wondering, I mean, if you see elements of that in the novel, and what other philosophers do you think might be being invoked, if any specifically?
My knowledge of the ancients is pretty minimal. I read Aristotle's Ethics, I don't know how many times, and find it extremely difficult, and the Poetics. And it sort of gets to I think Aristotle through Shaftesbury, right? Now what puzzles me is my own understanding of Aristotle versus Plato is that they're actually quite different, and particularly on the issue of aesthetics. This is maybe a popular misconception in literary studies, and it may be showing up in this article, but that she's more Aristotelian than Platonic because of the role that aesthetics plays, and the role that tragedy and comedy, and her recognition that they sort of turn on the same mainspring. It seems really profoundly Aristotelian to me. And Shaftesbury is often characterized as a Platonist, which puzzles me but then I think I'm more comfortable with my knowledge of Aristotle than with Plato. He seems very Aristotelian to me, and she is as well. And certainly there's been lots of work done in that regard. I mean, the whole idea of missing the mark is really the foundation of her ethics. Again, this is something that Ryle talked about in his essay that connects her with Aristotle and Shaftesbury. Virtue and vice for her are an excess or a deficiency.
Yes.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
I have a question about the soliloquizing. Must it always be so dull? Why is Fanny such a boring character if she's being held up as for our admiration? I reread the novel in preparation. I was looking for anything funny or clever she said, and there just wasn't anything.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps maybe you found something. And the one characteristic that she does seem to embody, most importantly at times for Austen, is her concern for others and her selflessness. And yet, if one had a due concern for others, one would perhaps try to enliven one's conversation a bit, or care for their amusement. I mean, not in a light and frivolous manner. But she seems so opposed to all sorts of frivolity. And yet, isn't there a place, as Aristotle would argue, for leisure, for wit?
It's one of Aristotle's virtues, is wit.
So I've been perplexed with Austen's commendation of Fanny. I can't help but see also some critique of her as well in the juxtaposition of Mary Crawford and her so closely together that one can't help but prefer Mary Crawford's company, if not her lifelong companionship.
Yeah, I think, one could argue perhaps that Jane Austen doesn't succeed in fully characterizing Fanny in the way that she describes her. That is, she describes her as having been greatly improved and sort of like she's much prettier, all these things that Sir Thomas notices about her when he returns from Antigua, and he's quite a different person also, more reflective. So we're told that she has become very pretty, and it's clear that Austen's trying to move her in the direction of Mary Crawford. But she never does become witty in herself. And so if Austen is trying to argue that in Fanny one sees both pleasure and virtue, Edmund himself criticizes himself for being too somber and boring, and he says, I couldn't strike out a piece of wit or a bon mot if my life depended on it. So we can see that he needs to be supplemented by some sense of aesthetics, giving more interesting sermons, and that Austen wants to say that Fanny can supply that. But we don't, I think you're right, we don't see her taking a witty pleasure or having a sense of humor. My theory of about that is that that's Emma. That, in other words, it's almost as if Fanny becomes attenuated as an embodied human being, because Austen wants to emphasize so much more the habit of mind. What is she? You know, she is herself the activity of soliloquy, which is an act of memory, reflection, self-reflection. And so as a living embodied person, she's kind of whittled away, right? We're told that she's very, when she herself talks about memory, how memory is sometimes so weak and so frail, it needs exercise. It's almost like she's describing herself. So that one could still attribute some control to Austen there, I think, that she more wants to emphasize Fanny as a habit of mind that she would like everybody to develop than she does as a fully realized character. And what we get with Emma, which is the subsequent novel, is we get this explosion of pages and pages and pages of soliloquizing, literally soliloquizing aloud. But Emma is also this witty, funny, right, somewhat nasty. She's the full potential, really, of a Mary Crawford. And so I think one can almost read it in a developmental way, that Emma has that kind of fullness of the best potential of a Mary Crawford that people would like to see in Fanny. And that I would have to admit she doesn't give us in this novel. Austen's pretty explicit, though, about the kind of pleasure that Fanny does offer. You know, Edmund says, you know, Fanny, it's just so restful to be with you. You know? And they dance together at one point, and they don't say anything. You know? And he wants the,
So I'm confused. Are you saying this is intentional to make Fanny dull, or was it an accidental on Austen's part? Was it intentional? And maybe there's an implied critique of her dullness, or you see this? There's no implied critique of Fanny.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that it's almost like the novel itself, right? Many people, the Mansfield Park is the least favorite novel of the six, and for precisely that reason. And yet the pleasures of Mansfield Park get deeper and deeper and deeper on rereading. And again, you know, you read it more. That's what she wants you to do, is to read and reread and reflect. And they're the quiet, contemplative, meditative pleasures that Fanny herself offers, I think.
Now, I do think Jane Austen's world is more remote from us than Aristotle's world. Jane Austen's world is going to look dull to someone living in 2012. When I teach persuasion, I try to give my students a measure of the world There's terrible secrets coming out about Mr. Elliot. It's going to destroy the whole relationship with Anne. And what is it? It's rumors of travel on the Sabbath. I actually have to explain to my students why that's wrong. There's a biblical prohibition against traveling on the Sabbath. And that, you know, I say you were expecting drug dealing maybe. But no, it comes out that he traveled on the Sabbath. That is the world that Jane Austen lived in. And it's just hard for us to recapture what would have been shocking to her even. I mean, and so it does, her world does look dull to us, Aristotle's doesn't.
But she gives, in this, she gives the good lines to Mary Crawford.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now if this, is Fanny, Jane Austen's picture of herself? And then you would think that there would be a certain almost irresistible temptation to her to, you know, a woman who's doing something that women didn't do, and that she would sort of explain herself and her antecedents and what makes her tick through her novels. Maybe all together, maybe not just in one. But if Fanny equals Jane Austen, that doesn't account for the wit, because she's a comedian. She's a magnificent comic writer. So, and also, does this connect to the theater that she's, in this novel, she's a little too severe on entertainment or theater. Maybe she's found a way to entertain us without endangering our morality or our or causing family squabbles, except about the meaning of what the novels are.
What's interesting on the entertainment front there is the ball that Sir Thomas throws for Fanny, because that's presented really as the alternative kind of entertainment, right? That is both pleasurable and virtuous. And it's got dancing and music and conversation and much attention paid to how Fanny gets dressed and her jewelry and all of that for that evening. And it's sort of the epitome of the good form of entertainment. At least as the novel presents it, and Fanny's coming out.
Can I ask a question in response of both of you, but in response to her, how she's dull? If she's her world seems dull to us, sorry. If the movies, spin-offs, I guess, her books don't seem that dull. They were pretty popular. I liked some of them. So I mean, what has something been done to make her world less dull in the movies, and is that unfaithful to her, or is it just kind of helpful Cliff's Notes? I mean, is the world so dull?
I think the movies haven't been particularly true to the spirit of Jane Austen.
Especially Mansfield and R.
I haven't seen that one, but I mean, they tend to glamorize the world and in many ways to democratize the stories. And I wouldn't use them as your Cliff Notes. I'd get the real Cliff Notes if you're going to not read the books and write exams on, because the movies could mislead you.
I guess I have to disagree with that, the description of her world as dull. I mean, I was listening to some of it in the car on the way down again this morning, and it's just a laugh a minute. I mean, it's just...
I'm not saying her novels are dull.
But her world, I think there's a reason that women today want to live in her world. There's something enormously attractive.
Treated with respect, for example.
But it's not, it's partly that, but it's not just that. It's a life of the mind. It's a life of the mind that's missing, a reflection on manners and morals that she's a master of, and that we lack all ability to judge one another and ourselves.
In a way, you're emphasizing my point, which is you turn on the news today and hear the events that are reported, And if you turned on the news in Jane Austen novels where the Napoleonic Wars are not reported, I mean, a piano is delivered to town and it's a complete sensation. That means there's no serial killer in that town. And that's what I'm talking about. It's a very narrow environment where what happens is utterly unshocking by our standards.
Yeah, I think that is the react. That many men I know react to the novels, and where are Napoleon's wars?
Yeah,
But
again,
it's very
I'm not
rare for
saying,
women
I'm
to
not
react.
talking about the novel, which are fascinating. I'm talking, though, that she does deal with a very narrow slice of reality in which the range of events is incredibly constricted by comparison with what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now, there aren't murders in these novels.
Yeah, but this is what I'm saying, that constricted world, that, for women, that can be the most important thing in life. And if you look at the gossip magazines, or even the discussion of the balls, it's a big world for women, and there's love there, and there's the development of what love means, and that's what's lacking in our world, and what women find in that world. But there are no sensational political events occurring, that's true.
I remember Leo Strauss's remark
Yeah.
about, I said, if you want to appreciate Xenophon, it's better to have the temper that prefers Jane Austen to Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if you could expand on your remark about Thomas and the name Thomas.
Well, I guess I was just trying to be witty, suggesting Thomas Aquinas, just suggesting a severe, again, a contrast. Sir Thomas's children are afraid of him. He's a severe disciplinarian, right? And the narrator says he was no friend to their pleasures. And so their whole relationship to him is defined by fear and awe, and they're very daunted when he's in the house, and they love it when he's away, and everything lets loose, right? So I was just suggesting maybe a parallel between, again, a notion of a more severe Orthodox Christian God there versus the kind of clergyman that Edmund Bertram is exemplifying in his education of Fanny, where he never uses fear, he never uses the promise of reward and punishment. He's basically her friend and comforts her and gets her pen and papers, gets her a horse so she can exercise. And she really flourishes and improves under that sort of gentle, human, friendly tutelage that she gets from Edmund. She's as afraid of Sir Thomas as the others.
Yeah, it hadn't occurred to me, and it seemed like an interesting thought, but I was wondering if there was any textual connections that you could find that made you.
It's just a
that
hazard,
feeling.
Why is the guy who looks most like a severe kind of God that denies everybody's pleasure is also called Thomas? Can I ask people a question? I don't know how to put together deism, or this kind of 18th century argument from design, particularly with Aristotelian teleology, because they're not the same thing, are they? Because there's no intentionality
That's right.
for Aristotle.
And no complication. It seems for deism that you can read God's design directly in nature. But I think you presented better in your article that it takes art in order to bring out the implicit, what is implicit, to make it explicit in nature. Art and imagination. So that it isn't simply a matter of seeing directly what is natural, but you have to present it to yourself, and it has to be presented to you. So something like a novel is needed, in addition to, say, physics, to understand nature. And that's because nature is better seen, so to speak, through human vision, and with the human element added in, which also complicates it and makes it necessary to interpret, and also capable of being disputed. But so that, so nature as a standard, I think, is much more difficult and problematic than the theists would suppose. They want to make it possible for you to get at nature without having to go through interpretation, especially biblical interpretation.
But you also have the fact that deism comes after Christianity, and Aristotle's teleology comes before it, and so Aristotle has much lower expectations of nature. Nature can fail. It has purposes, but it doesn't always accomplish them. Deism succeeds upon the notion of an omnipotent and good God who doesn't fail in his purposes and never makes mistakes. And so in some ways, deism is forced to reconcile what appear to be defects of nature with perfection. I mean, that's the whole joke in Voltaire's Candide, and the whole reaction to what was thought of as Leibnizian optimism, that there's actually a difference in the underlying notion of nature post-Christianity, where this natural world is an act of complete perfection. And that's in Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. That's how he makes mincemeat of deism there. Whereas Aristotle had much lower expectations of nature. It fails all the time. You still take your bearing by the perfection of the thing, but you don't expect that perfection to manifest itself everywhere and always. Well, that's a very good question. Yes.
Sorry, just one small question. Do you have any idea whether, what group of audiences were Jane Austen targeted at, in her time? Because all her scenes in the six novels seem to deal with scenes in the villages, life in the villages, as opposed to a city dweller's life. And what do you make of that? Do you think she will think that her novels would be appealing to city dwellers or workers class?
Well, she's writing for readers, which is just a widely expanding group in her time, right? She mentions circulating libraries, that those had come into being even at the end of Mansfield Park. So I suppose at the time it would have been middle class and upper class readers. It's interesting that in Mansfield Park again, she addresses the poverty of the Price family in Portsmouth, but even Fanny's drunken father reads the newspaper. He picks up on the story of the adultery in the newspaper. So, and mostly, actually, many women, I would think. I mean, probably the biggest expansion in the reading public was the female taste for novels, increasingly dealing with domestic life. What again is so interesting about this novel is you don't see Jane Austen anywhere else making these claims for herself, I don't think. I think the passage about Shakespeare at the end becoming a part of every Englishman's constitution, that his vocabulary becomes assimilated into the manners and mores and the plays and everything, and is gradually changing the character of even the entire nation. And it's the only place I know where she explicitly addresses that possibility of a readership that has expanded to the point that she could alter from the inside, through novels, or that women novelists can do this. Tremendously, uncharacteristically, almost immodest, one would say. I don't know if that's getting it.
Certainly, she wouldn't have expected working class readers, because the working class was illiterate at this point in the 19th century's enormous expansion of working class literacy in the course of the 19th century, but that was later through people like Dickens, and it was the novel that made England a literate country. But on the country-city aspect, it's the whole the Beverly Hillbillies motif. People in cities like to read about the country. And England was starting to massively urbanize in Jane Austen's very lifetime. But going into the 19th century, England was still largely a rural country. The city of Manchester basically didn't even exist in 1800.
I think she wants to reform the upper classes and the urbanites insofar as, you know, she really doesn't like court life, and aristocrats are caricatured or satirized in her novels too. So she's maybe has them in mind.
I mean, her idea of the good life was very xenophobic. It was the life of country gentlemen. Remote from the court and its evils, and remote from the cities. Bath is one of the most evil places in the world, according to Jane Austen.
I just thought of something more, though, interesting along the line of your question. The Prince Regent of the time asked her to dedicate Emma to him, and she did it reluctantly.
Didn't she refuse?
No, I think.
No, she did it. She did it.
Yeah. There's a brilliant reading, actually, by a political theorist, of one of the riddles in Emma as being an incredible satire on the Prince Regent, Colleen Shand.
Oh. Well, I think it remains to thank you, Lorraine, for this wonderful
you.
presentation.
Thank you.
Very great.